Hello, hello. Hang on a sec. Let me just turn the banging techno off. Okay, welcome back to Paint Like Fiend, the Tzeentch Slaughter Priest painting tutorial where we don't actually show you how to paint a Tzeentch Slaughter Priest. And this episode is no exception. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on blending, highlighting, shading, lining, just really hammer these techniques down, really get them sorted so that when I apply them to the model it should make more sense what I'm doing without having to go into more detailed explanations. So first things first, one useful tip I've found to make any colour transitions for highlighting and shading easier, and you can sort of see this almost in action on here, is the colours you use to shade or highlight your base colour. It is a lot easier if they are very natural shades or tones. I don't know which way around this is. Very natural versions of the base colour. So if you're starting, say, with this kind of muted orange here, and you're trying to highlight it with a bright yellow or shade it with a dull green or something, you can get some interesting effects like that. But in general, it will be harder to get a nice smooth transition. Generally, in reality, with kind of neutral, natural lighting, the shadow areas will be kind of darker and more muted. The highlight areas will be kind of brighter and a bit desaturated, and the mid-tones will be where you'll get kind of most of the colour on that. So I find sticking to kind of natural versions of the base colour, for example, for purples here, these are all quite natural. It makes it easier, it makes the transitions look a bit smoother even before you start blending and whatever. You can mix in white to the base colour for highlighting. You can mix in black for shading. This can work quite well as long as you're careful with the amounts you mix. You can also, there are also ways of getting a bit of contrast in the shadows. For example, with red, adding a tiny little bit of dark green or dark blue, which really tones down that colour. For highlighting, I find mixing in some pale colours, such as these here, you can see those, can work really well. So the orange on here, rather than mixing in pure white, I mixed in a bone colour, and that works very nicely. You wouldn't want to mix in, say, a greyish colour for that. It could look a bit, just wouldn't look right. So yeah, consider your colours carefully. I find, I say, mixing in black or white, or in particular pale colours instead of white, or very muted versions of the base colours instead of black, is helpful rather than changing the actual colour too much. Also, if you have a really good selection of colours, like the purples I previously indicated, Games Workshop and other companies do a vast range of colours, and I find having a good selection of pre-mixed colours ready available can make the whole process a lot easier. So back onto some more specific applications of blending and colour transitions applicable to shading and highlighting. One thing to go into a bit more detail on is highlighting on curved or rounded surfaces. These surfaces here have gone to an edge. It's quite clear that you highlight here, blend back from that. Any sort of hard-edged armour, plates, swords, weapons, anything like that, is quite easy to judge where to highlight to, where to blend back from. Rounded surfaces like kind of muscles or really kind of rounded clothes can be a little bit tricky because you don't have the edge. Games Workshop, with their kind of basic painting, tend to highlight muscles to an edge with like almost going to a line around it, which is easier to do, but I think looks a bit weird. It's good if you can try and get something that goes a bit more with a curve highlight to a sort of more central area and kind of get like a smooth rounded progression around that. Going along with that, I've got a little bit of a pro tip for making sure you get good paint coverage on an area like this. So I'm going to start with a little mix of the mid purple here. Now we could apply this this slightly lighter paint in the centre of the area and then blend around it immediately, but if the paints are too opaque or we need to get a good coverage with just a few blends, you can actually apply an area first as a solid layer, like so, and let this dry. YouTube, deep fried crispy shredded cat. Now this will be hard to pick up on camera, depending on the angle of it, but there is now an oval in the centre of that of a slightly lighter colour. Obviously this at the moment is just a layer, so there will be that abrupt edge of it, particularly noticeable obviously if you go with a lighter colour. But now you can reapply the same colour over the top of that, maybe in a slightly wider area, like so. Moisten the brush and then feather the edge around it. Keep smoothing out that edge. And what this will mean is, although the edge will have the necessary smooth boundary, the colour in the centre of it, the highlight colour, will remain fairly strong. And this just means if the paint you're using is quite translucent, it means you can build up a reasonably solid highlight colour on this, as well as the blending. So I'm going to do this in a few more steps, probably speed it up, and hopefully get sort of smooth, a simulation of a smooth rounded surface here. Okay, there we go. It's not perfect, it's still a bit rough. I could have maybe used more actual colour transitions there, but it shows that you can get a sort of rounded highlight on that. Another possibly useful technique is using the semi-translucent nature of the paints themselves to get a little bit of a faded edge on the colour you're applying before you even do any actual blending or feathering on it. This can be a sort of transition between layering and blending, or just provide a basis for these techniques. And this relies on the layer paints from Games Workshop, or comparable examples, being sort of fairly translucent anyway. They don't cover that well, which is, I guess, frustrating for base coating, etc. But for colour transitions you can actually use that. So if I apply a paint on here, like so, and then if I actually apply it like that, the bottom edge of it is fairly translucent in the first place. When this dries, there won't be a strong edge there, and this means when you're applying, say, now you can apply another coat and blend it over the top, and that translucency will be useful. Kind of semi-smooth transition here is just literally from not completely covering that with paint, just using the translucency, not applying the brush so hard. So if I get a sort of similar mixture now and apply it over, that'll build it up, and again you can see it's almost getting a blend there already. If I dry this, I could do that again with the Cindertone in there. I guess this is sort of between all three techniques. You're using layers, but they're not as thin down as the thin layers. You're using the translucency comparable to the very thin layers, and the way you're kind of pulling the brush across is sort of almost like smudging the edge a bit as you're doing it. It's not something I rely on in itself, but it can be a good start. This now, if I was to let that dry, I won't actually do over the whole thing, but put a bit more paint on there, and then feather the edge of that. That could actually start getting quite a nice transition there when that dries. Right, let me just apply a tiny bit of paint here for this next bit. This area is sort of vaguely reminiscent of, well, sort of hanging testicles really or something, but it's useful for the next demonstration. Once you've done with the blending and stuff, you often, particularly with the hard edged areas, you want to do some kind of lining, either lining the edges to produce a crisp highlight, or maybe lining the shadows to get really distinct creases in the model. Get some colour distinctions between areas. The old technique of pure black lining to delineate areas has kind of gone out of favour because it was a bit too harsh and a bit too abrupt. But you can use a little bit of lining in places, and it does help distinguish colours or accentuate the deepest creases. To do that, there's a couple of things to be aware of. Obviously, you want your paint slightly thinned down. You want a good quality brush. I'm actually going to bodge it with the Citadel brush, but get your Winsor & Newton Series 7s out for this one. So imagine this area here is a sort of shaded sort of crease like that. You want to accentuate that area, whatever obscene gynecological area that is. So I'm going to mix a little bit of purple and a little bit of black. So this is sort of like a dull greyish colour. A little bit of paint on the brush, not much. Bring it to a tip. And then as with applying base coats, you want to use the brush, go in the direction of the line. If you try and go sideways along the line like that, it's going to be quite difficult. The brush will splay, you won't be able to get it as accurate. You're having to control your hand in a sort of strange kind of motion there. If you manage to hold the area and actually get the brush going along smoothly, that can be a lot easier. A little bit of handshake there, maybe too much coffee this morning. Quite a straight line there. So there's a little bit of a line. It really is starting to look like a pair of love spuds now. That is entirely, it could have been accidental. Could have been accidental. And again, get a slightly darker tone here. A little bit on the brush. Again, draw it in the right direction there. Like so. And you get a real distinct crease there. Same with highlighting edges. There's kind of two edges you'll have to highlight. One will be where it's quite indistinct, where it doesn't stand out that much from the model. And these ones where you have to just paint it on with the tip of the brush as normal. Get a bright colour here. And again, you just want to run it along the edge. The brush won't naturally stay on the edge. It might naturally stay in the crease, it won't naturally stay on the edge. So you do have to be careful and have a steady hand. And again, rather than going across the edge, which can be quite difficult, you can run the brush along it. That can be easier to control. So again, I'm going to do that here. Imagine this edge is to be highlighted, and just the edge of an armour plate. Paint's quite thin. Give it another. So there's actually a little dark line I've left, which is not intentional. So that would get you a nice crisp edge. I find with this, I don't like to thin down the colour too much because it can just be too translucent. You have to do it too many times. I tend to thin it down only a little bit. The other method, and this is a really nice, well-established trick, if you've got an edge that's very crisp and distinct, you can run the side of the brush along it, like so. And if you've got the right amount of paint, that'll naturally just produce a really clear, distinct edge line. If you try and do it with a brush this way, it's easy to fall off one side or the other. So running along the edge can be really useful for this. So a little bit of paint on the brush there. Just run it along. That's a bit hard to see because I've got the white there. but it works really well. Okay, one more thing to discuss before I move on to actual proper painting is the areas you shade and the areas you highlight. I guess there's been two main schools of thought on this. Just move that. Two main schools of thought on this. The old school was where you basically anything in a recess you'd shade, anything that stood out you'd highlight, which really accentuated the 3D aspect of the model, but didn't look very natural. It didn't really mimic any sort of lighting you'd find in the real world. The very new school way of doing it is imagine a light kind of directly from above, which is zenithal lighting, and anything that's going to catch that light from above you highlight, anything below you shade, including probably self-shadowing on the model. What I tend to do is I tend to do a sort of mixture between the two. If I'm highlighting an area, say the helmet, I'll definitely highlight from above, but I also do a little bit of highlighting on lower bits, particularly the edges, just to make these little bits a bit more distinct. I think the eye in reality would tend to be able to pick these out, so you're trying to exaggerate on the model to make them easier to pick out on a smaller scale. So there'll be areas underneath here where I won't highlight very much, but I will put these, in reality might not catch much light, but I will put a little bit of a highlight on those just to make them stand out. Areas above like this I'll highlight quite heavily because they would catch the light more. So it's a mixture of the two techniques. You know, try and get most of your highlighting from above, not necessarily directly above, but maybe in an area around above the model. But then you know, do pick out some of the details and do a little bit of highlighting below to show the areas, the details in those areas. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is I'll actually do some painting on the skull and use a lot of techniques I've demonstrated here.